Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service on this Tuesday, March 8th, 2022. And we're going to have to jump right into things. I don't have a lot of time this evening for the public segment. We have another system, a low pressure system coming out of the North Pacific that's going to ride up along the eastern part of the Aleutians into the southeast Bering. It's going to spread moisture from southwest along both sides of the Alaska Range to along and south of the Yukon River, as well as on up through Cook Inlet and on over toward the Copper River Basin. And this will be as we head through tomorrow and especially into Thursday, early Friday. It is going to create some milder temperatures in the southwest and south central areas. We've already seen temperatures this afternoon, mid-40s, king salmon, some downslope winds there with the easterly flow. And certainly by Thursday, Anchorage could have temperatures up around 40 degrees. But it's also going to create some areas of wintry precipitation. I'll highlight that in a moment, where there are some advisories and warnings. And then don't forget this weekend, the time change on Sunday, spring ahead 1 hour. And it is looking like we'll see at least a briefly colder period of temperatures here for the mainland and southwest by early next week, along with some drier conditions. Quick check of what we got going on out there this afternoon. Bethel, we have virga. That's precipitation that evaporates or sublimates before it reaches the ground. Those are some nimbostratus clouds, but you can see it's not quite reaching the ground. Temperature there 37 this afternoon. Delta Junction there up just north of the Alaska Range, mostly cloudy and breezy. They're getting wind gusts of over 30 miles an hour from the southeast with the temperature at 22. There is a winter storm warning in effect for Wednesday afternoon through early Friday morning for the Delta Junction area, including the central eastern Alaska Range, where as much as a foot of snow could fall. And here are the advisories that are currently posted. We have along on the south side, the eastern portion of the Brooks Range down through the Yukon Flats, Fairbanks, Bettles, Tanana, where at least a few inches of snow are going to fall, along with blowing and drifting snow. There are going to be some stronger wind setup. And then the areas in red are the winter storm warnings, where locally a foot or maybe a bit more in some of the higher elevations there along the central eastern Alaska Range into the 40-mile gold country as you go up the upper Tanana Valley. And then the Copper River Basin around Glen Allen could easily pick up 3 to 6 inches of snow, especially the northern portion of the Copper River Basin. And then in the southwest, Bethel could see a period of freezing rain Wednesday evening into early Thursday morning, maybe 1/10 of an inch of ice. Well, we can start to see some of that moisture lifting to the north across the Alaska Peninsula this afternoon to along the southwest coast, and that's the leading edge, the vanguard of that low pressure system that'll be coming up out of the North Pacific. It's not especially strong, but it will be deepening. Meanwhile, we have high pressure that'll be situated over the Arctic Ocean. That high is gradually going to build southeastward into northwest Canada, especially as we go through the weekend into early next week, which is going to develop more of an easterly flow across the mainland and bring that colder air from east to west as we go through Sunday and especially early next week. So today we have that low well to the south. It starts to emerge in the picture late tonight, early on Wednesday morning, with a trough extending across along and just west and north of the Alaska Range. And then Wednesday afternoon we see that low coming up there from the North Pacific just south of the tip of the Alaska Peninsula. And then it will continue developing and deepening a bit on Thursday, and all that moisture is going to be pushing up across the southern half of the state, especially up to about the Yukon River. Some of the snowfall could be heavier, as I mentioned, in the central eastern Alaska Range. And we expect that precipitation to shift eastward Wednesday night into Thursday into the Panhandle, maybe resulting in some advisories. Otherwise, temperatures across the state tonight into Wednesday morning, coldest below zero there, North Slope Arctic coast. Temperatures will stay above freezing along the southwest coast, Bristol Bay, the Alaska Peninsula, including Kodiak Island. Temperatures Wednesday afternoon, we anticipate readings to be into the mid-40s there at Kodiak, King Salmon. And we'll see readings stay below zero right along the Arctic coast and North Slope, and kind of in between there along the Yukon River. For Thursday morning, anticipate Lows to be as cold as the 15 to around 20 below there along the Arctic coast and north slope, but readings generally in the teens along the middle Yukon River and southern portions of the Seward Peninsula, but staying above freezing there in the southwest and extending out along Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula. And then Thursday afternoon, we see temperatures in the 40s. Again, portions of the southwest, including the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, maybe even bumping some readings up near 40 all the way up to Anchorage, and also some more 40-degree readings, especially along the outer coast, the western and southern portions of the Panhandle. And let's quick take a look then at the 6 to 10 day temperature outlook. So what's going to happen is initially we're going to see this milder air come in here for the mid and late week across southwest and southern parts of the state. But as the system works its way east, we're going to see the high build across northern parts of the state into northwest Canada. That's going to shift the flow to be more easterly. That's going to backdoor some colder air in from the north and east across the mainland into the Alaska Peninsula as we go into mid-month. And that would be especially notable here by early next week. Precipitation-wise, with that kind of pattern, it's going to turn the spigot off from the North Pacific, Bering, and Gulf. So we do anticipate some drier weather there over the western and southwestern portions of the state as we go into especially Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday next week. We may see the precipitation bump up a bit, especially across the southern portion of the Panhandle. But otherwise, after a brief warm-up in southwest and south central areas, expect some colder temperatures by early next week.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Well, let's take now a look at your flying weather. If you do have a flight planned Wednesday into Thursday, the main weather features will be an area of high pressure up over the Arctic Ocean, just north of the Arctic coast. That will eventually be building southeastward into northwest Canada as we go into the weekend. Meanwhile, an area low pressure will be lifting northward from the North Pacific across the eastern Aleutians and slowly up into the lower southeastern quadrant of the Bering Sea. And that is what's going to bring a fair amount of moisture and milder temperatures up along the Alaska Peninsula through Cook Inlet and pushing it inland on both sides of the Alaska Range as we head here through the latter half of the week. As a result, we expect some rather widespread IFR conditions from around the central Yukon Valley in the interior all the way down along the southwest coast, portions of the West Gulf, and especially on the North Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians. By the time we get into Wednesday afternoon, we see IFR conditions along the Alaska Range, as well as in pockets north and south. We also see expanding areas of IFR conditions from the Gulf out along the North Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula and up through the Aleutians, all the way up to St. Paul, St. George, St. Matthew, and Nunavik Island to along the lower Kuskokwim Yukon deltas. And by Thursday morning, IFR conditions are rather widespread from along and south of the Alaska Range in through coastal areas of the Gulf, as well as along the southwest coast and the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula. On Thursday afternoon, some of that moisture does push further east and will put much of the Panhandle, northern Gulf Coast under IFR conditions with a little improvement there, especially back through the southwest interior. Looking at past conditions on Wednesday, Anaktuvik will see IFR conditions become MVFR. Adigan Pass may see IFR conditions in the morning becoming MVFR. And then as we go further south and west, generally MVFR conditions are anticipated in the vicinity of Lake Clark and Merrill passes, but there could be some areas of IFR, especially out toward Cook Inlet. And then Rainy Pass should generally be in IFR conditions during the day on Wednesday. As we round the central Alaska Range, look for MVFR conditions at Windy becoming IFR. Isabel, areas Isabel eastward toward Mentasta, will see VFR conditions in the morning becoming IFR as that moisture spreads from southwest to northeast. And as we get down around Tanita Pass, look for VFR conditions briefly there early in the day becoming IFR. And Portage Pass will generally see IFR conditions in the eastern half out through Prince William Sound, whereas more likely see MVFR conditions along the western half and there at the west entrance. And then finally, in the northern Panhandle, Chilkoot and White will enjoy one more day at least of VFR conditions. Looking at the freezing levels, we do see a bump of the freezing line, rising of surface freezing levels up into the southwest interior to just south of the Alaska Range to the inner channels of the Panhandle, with 2, 4, and even 6,000 foot freezing levels there, especially as you get out to the Alaska Peninsula. Kodiak Island, as a push of milder air is going to be working its way northeastward, especially up there through Cook Inlet. As a result, in areas of precipitation, we're going to see snow in the colder air in the southwest interior up into the lower middle Yukon Valley, generally 3,000 to 9,000 feet, with a chance of some considerable moderate turbulence there, or I'm sorry, considerable moderate icing along portions of the southwest coast, where there will be a chance of mixed precipitation changing to rain as the air will be warmer the further south and west you go, and then certainly mainly rain along the Alaska Peninsula, North Pacific side into Kodiak Island, with the exception of the highest elevations, and generally higher freezing levels resulting in icing between 6,000 and 16,000 feet. Upper level jet stream winds, there's an anticyclonic jet core from the Alcan border into northwest Canada up around 100, 110 knots. And then getting down to mid-levels at 9,000 feet, we see southeast to south flow across the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island upwards to 40 and 50 knots. And then an area of anticyclonic flow over the lower Chukchi Sea into eastern Russia, 40 to as high as 50 knots through the Bering Strait. And as we bring it down to 3,000 feet, low pressure circulation there just south of the eastern Aleutians in the North Pacific. That will slowly lift northward, with strongest winds on the west side of the state, including the Bering Strait and around St. Lawrence, on the order of 50 to 55 knots out of the east-northeast. And the greatest threat for turbulence there in the west will be the surface to 4,000 feet, including Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence, and portions south side of Norton Sound, as well as much of the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, extending westward into the western half of the Aleutians, surface to 3,000 feet.
I can't really name anyone that has so much integrity as she does to the things that she's accomplishing. It's pretty amazing. Having Claire as a role model, just a strong woman in science and just so smart and so kind. It's just a huge confidence booster. Is that, hey, I could do that too, you know? That's possible, that's successful, that's what I want to do.
I would characterize her as a pioneer in the field.
The amount and quality of the work she's put out is second to none.
I know people who have a lot of tenacity. I know people that have integrity, but it's rare that people have both together in that, that combination that Claire does.
Every morning, Dr. Claire Parkinson gets up before sunrise and runs 2 miles to work. She hasn't missed a day in nearly 40 years. To know the evolution of sea ice and how we observe it from space is to know Claire. This year, she's celebrating 40 years at NASA.
When I arrived at Goddard, which was in July of 1978, it was an incredibly exciting period here. Satellites were pretty new, but a lot of data had been collected.
NASA scientists were inundated with information, and Claire was in a cohort looking at sea ice, trying to make sense of a jumble of very raw, very new data. It was around that time that Claire and her team, at the time led by Dr. Jays Wally, created the principal sea ice record that we use today. How does something like that record help you do your job?
Oh, that record is fundamental to understanding sea ice. So without it, we wouldn't know how rapidly it's changing.
You may not realize it, but Claire's work studying the changing extent of the ice caps deeply affected our understanding of climate change, and relatedly, our understanding of how climate change affects life on Earth.
One of the clearest signals for climate change that resonates with people has been this shrinking of the polar ice cap in the summer that we're able to see because of Claire's work.
After we had a record that was about 15, 20 years long, we started noticing that the extent of the ice in the Arctic was getting smaller over time.
Sea ice is formed on the surface of the ocean and therefore is made from seawater. The biggest concentration is in the Arctic, and it's also where the biggest loss in sea ice is occurring. Every year, NASA reports on the sea ice minimum and maximum extents. As expected, the data is concerning.
By now, not only has this trend toward lesser ice continued, but it's even accelerated, so that now the decreases are greater than what they had been.
These trends are deeply troubling, but one thing's for sure. Our awareness of shrinking sea ice extent due to climate change was propelled faster and further after Claire Parkinson arrived at NASA.
I mean, she takes her job seriously, and the health and welfare of those instruments in space, yeah, she's on it. You know, it's one of the things you don't worry about because Claire's in the loop on these things. It's going to be fine.
In science, we stand on the shoulders of giants, on the shoulders of those who explored before us. But then, some among us are giants.
For a scientist, it's incredibly exciting to be studying these glaciers and ice sheets right now because they're doing something that hasn't happened in thousands of years. We're watching changes take place that haven't happened since the end of the last ice age. Tuesday was cold, I almost froze my toes. Oh, what's it gonna be next week? Who knows? That's climate. Oh, that's the climate you got. You take a bunch of weather and you average it together and you're doing the climate rock.
At a glacial pace, it means something's happening so slowly you can barely tell it's happening at all. That used to describe the very incremental movement glaciers and ice sheets experienced each year. But now that's changing. We're tagging along with 3 NASA scientists to understand the different lengths they go to not only investigate ice sheets and glaciers, but also communicate their often complicated science to the public. First, let's get oriented. Ice sheets, in pink, pretty much occur in only 2 places, Antarctica and Greenland. Glaciers, in yellow, play a key role draining melt off the ice sheet. Glaciers are also found in the high mountains, but we'll get to those in another episode.
So we know that something's happening in Greenland right now that's unprecedented in the last several thousand years.
That's Dr. Josh Willis, oceanographer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Josh and his team are tackling one of the major environmental challenges of the 21st century, trying to answer fundamental questions about how melting glaciers impact sea level rise.
With my mission, Oceans Melting Greenland, or OMG for short, we're trying to understand just how much of Greenland's melt is caused by the oceans.
Along with being one of NASA's top scientists working on the cryosphere, Josh is passionate about demystifying climate change in typically unconventional ways.
I think by reaching out to people with a little bit of humor, a little bit of fun, maybe a song, you really have the opportunity to help people understand and come to terms with what we're doing to our planet. Because it's definitely happening and it's definitely a big deal, and we need to start preparing for it.
Down at the opposite pole, Dr. Kelly Brunt is getting ready for a major expedition.
In December and January this coming year, I'll actually be in Antarctica, down near the South Pole, collecting ground-based GPS data.
This is actually Kelly's second expedition to the South Pole. The first occurred in December and January of last year. Both surveys are critical and will help validate data collected by NASA's airborne campaign, Operation Icebridge, and the recently launched satellite mission ISAT-2.
All three of these layers, that ground-based, that airborne, and the satellite, are all tied together. The ground-based helps validate both the satellite and the airborne helps give us more validation data for the satellites, but also a bigger story with respect to the depth of the ice sheet and what's going on underneath the surface.
While some scientists are taking measurements in the field, others are looking for answers in physics and lines of code.
For me, those projections that we are doing, they do have a very personal meaning.
Dr. Sophie Nowicki is an ice sheet modeler. That means she and her team have the important job of forecasting how ice will change in the future, which also predicts changes in sea level rise. It's a job she doesn't take lightly, especially since urban planning and infrastructure use her team's models to make decisions about the future and safety of their communities.
When we make those projections that are 100 years in the future, 100 years can seem so far away, like I don't have to worry about it, it's just too far. But actually they are not. It's really like the future that we are looking at that our children or grandchildren will see to experience.
Whether it's learning to communicate in new ways, traversing a swath of Antarctica in a massive piston bully, or taking responsibility for an impactful climate forecast, our NASA explorers are pushing the limits of discovery every day. But on a very human level, they're people with families and friends who have a stake in finding out why and how the planet is changing as rapidly as it is.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it. And so when we try to understand the thresholds for life, where life might exist elsewhere in our solar system and the universe, water is one of those things that we look for.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back, and looking at the sea ice edge, we'll start along the Arctic coast. Temperatures up that way will remain below zero here in the next couple of days, so plenty of cold air to keep the ice maintenance there in place. As we go down, though, further southward, the lower Chukchi Sea, we'll start to see some winds picking up, and especially once you get down along the west coast into the Bering. Nevertheless, we do anticipate the pressure gradient to increase across the central parts of the state, and that will drive some stronger winds coming off the west, central, and southwest mainland. Otherwise, there are polynyas that have opened up there along the western, southwestern shores. The overall tendency for the ice is for it to move west and southward here the next couple of days as low pressure lifts up across the far eastern end of the Aleutians and tip of the Alaska Peninsula into the southeast Bering. So going way over the Panhandle first, Wednesday marine forecast, inner channels 10 to 15 knots, southeast winds, waves a couple of feet. Outer coast, southeast winds around 20 knots, turning a little more easterly as you get up west of Yakutat, and waves generally around 7-8 feet. And then on Thursday, look for the inner channels, winds strongest down toward Ketchikan, Metlakatla, including Dixon Entrance. They're upwards around 25 knots, waves 4 or 5 feet. And along the coast, winds will be south, turning southeasterly at 30 knots with waves anywhere from 7 to as high as 11 feet Yakutat westward. Across the northwest Gulf, we'll see strongest winds on Wednesday just off of the entrance there of Cook Inlet, northeast of Kodiak, 40-knot easterly winds. And look for northeast winds 15 knots, Prince William Sound, and north-northeast around 25 knots through the lower half of Cook Inlet. On Thursday, winds will be over the northwest Gulf, generally out of the southeast, 25 to as high as 30 knots south of Cordova. Easterly winds 20 knots, 4-foot waves there in the vicinity of Prince William Sound. And northeast to east winds 25 to 30 knots through the lower half of Cook Inlet. Across Kodiak Island in the Alaska Peninsula, winds will generally be out of the northeast to east, 20 to 25 knots on the North Pacific Gulf side and around 25 knots on the Bering side. And then on Thursday, we expect winds to be a little more southwesterly there along the North Pacific side, especially off and south of Kodiak Island. And then out of the southeast and south to 20 knots, Bristol Bay down to just north of Cold Bay. Across the eastern Aleutians, winds will generally be out of the northeast to east, 20 to 25 knots on Wednesday, and waves 4 to 9 feet across the Bering side, and perhaps 8 to 12 feet or so on the North Pacific side. By Thursday, the low pressure center will have lifted just to the northeast of Unalaska, and we expect winds to turn more to the southwest and west at about 25 to 30 knots across much of the Aleutians. Waves 13-14 feet on the North Pacific side and 8 to 12 feet on the Bering side. More importantly, Wednesday winds will be picking up along the ice shield there across the central, northern, eastern Bering, along the west coast, and up to 30 knots. So that's going to cause the ice to want to shift south and westwards. And then as we go into Thursday, those winds, as the pressure gradient increases across the central interior, we expect winds to be as high as 40 knots there through Norton Sound and between Nunavik Island and St. Lawrence during the day on Thursday, which again will serve to press that ice further south and west. On Wednesday, across the Arctic coast, winds generally out of the north-northeast 15 knots. They'll pick up to 30 knots from the northeast, especially around and south of Cape Lisburne and Point Hope, down through the Bering Strait. And on Thursday, winds will be more variable of 5 to 10 knots along the Arctic coast, but turn northeasterly at 25 to 30 knots there through the lower Chukchi Sea south of Cape Lisburne, and pick up to as high as 40 knots, especially off the Seward Peninsula on the north side of St. Lawrence Island. And looking at the synoptic map here for late tonight, early on Wednesday morning, low pressure will be lifting up out through the North Pacific, approaching the far eastern Aleutians. That low by Wednesday afternoon will continue to deepen, about 987 millibars, spreading snow across the interior along and south of the Yukon River. And then as we get into the day on Thursday, that low will be sitting kind of right along the tip of the Alaska Peninsula, far eastern Aleutians, with high pressure ridge extending from eastern Russia across the north slope into northwest Canada. And we expect snow to continue on along and south of the Yukon River through the Alaska Range, with some areas of rain and mixed precipitation down toward the coast into the southwest interior. Have a good night, and thanks for watching.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.